So this exhibition that we are doing here is quite unique in terms of its format, because it is based on an exhibition, but it is also trying to re-engage with an existing exhibition and expand it, in that sense that Bauhaus as an institution celebrated its 100 years, and in context of that centenary celebration, Grant Watson and other associated curators, they formulated a travelling exhibition on the 100 years activity of Bauhaus. So there is an exhibition which has already been curated, which has its own structure and its own formation, which can be improvised. Like, as if you take it to different places, the whole structure of the installation is planned in such a way that it can be placed in different architectural conditions, different rooms, and it can be moved around.
So this was organized to mark the centenary in 2019, which was the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the Bauhaus. And it was a large-scale project which was commissioned by the Bauhaus Cooperation, which are the three archives in Berlin, Dessau and Weimar, and the Goethe-Institut and the House of World Cultures in Berlin. And Marion van Osten, the late Marion van Osten, and myself were invited to curate the project, and to think in particular about the transcultural reception of the Bauhaus. So there had been many exhibitions that looked at the Bauhaus during the period when it was active as a school, but this was intended to think about the kind of Bauhaus in terms of its reception beyond Europe and North America.
Marion van Osten and Grant Watson did a major research in different parts of the world on the influence of Bauhaus on parallel movements, but also on the question, tracing the question in how far Bauhaus, as one of the major art and design schools at the beginning of the 20th century, had been influenced by other movements. So they traveled to Africa, North and South America, to Japan, to China, and also to India. And so it's a transnational perspective which they highlighted in their research and in the exhibition, and all the results of the research, all the materials and artworks created during the process then had been presented at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin in 2019.
There is also another history to this whole context, is that during these 100 years there was a very important exhibition that happened with the initiative of Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, in 1922, where he invited, because it is also important to mention in this context that Shantiniketan as a institution was formally also initiated in 1990. So it was Tagore was looking for this moment where he would invite the school with its faculty, pedagogues, artists who are working with the institution, to come and share their work in Kolkata. And in that context, both Bauhaus and Shantiniketan share a certain commonness. So 1922 became that moment where Bauhaus came to Kolkata, and there was an exhibition where artists like Paul Klee, Kandinsky, and many of the other modern practitioners, so-called in those days avant-garde practitioners, they were exhibiting in Oriental society. And in that exhibition, a lot of Bengal school artists also exhibited, of which Tagore was also there, Gaganinath, Abhinanath, and all these artists were there. But necessarily it was not a commonness they were trying to generate, but it's an encounter of these two so-called anti-academic and anti-imperial projects.
The very first exhibition of Bauhaus materials that happened outside of Germany took place in Calcutta in 1922. And this came about through the initiative of Stella Kramrich, who was an art historian who was working at Shantiniketan, had been invited by Tagore to teach art history and ran a course there. And she knew Johannes Itten from Vienna. And so she wrote a letter to Itten saying, would it be possible to have an exhibition of Bauhaus in Calcutta, and he agreed, and they agreed, and a folio of material was sent to Calcutta, and it was shown alongside the work of artists from the Bengal School and others in the exhibition as a kind of juxtaposition of these two different types of work, or these two different bodies of work from different locations and geographies and cultures.
Priyanka Raja, she approached Goethe-Institut and she said, why don't we show this exhibition, the Bauhaus Imaginista exhibition, here in Calcutta? Because one chapter of the whole research had been done in West Bengal, in Calcutta, in Shantiniketan. There had been the 1922 exhibition on Bauhaus, with Indian and Bauhaus artists combined. So there is interesting historic material, and she said it would be really nice to bring together the research, but also show it now at the Indian Museum, which is also the first time that Goethe-Institut, Mueller Bhavan Kolkata cooperates with the Indian Museum in a exhibition project.
We had got a request from the Goethe-Institut here in Kolkata, so they had met us, requested us whether we would be interested to house this exhibition called the Bauhaus Imaginista at the Indian Museum. And going by the history, we all are aware that in 1919 the Bauhaus movement started, and incidentally the first international exhibition of the Bauhaus movement, it happened in Kolkata. In fact, that time it was called Calcutta. And when the Bauhaus Imaginista exhibition was developed basically to commemorate the centenary of this exhibition, so we thought that it would be very appropriate if we can have this exhibition here in Indian Museum.
And so in discussions with the Goethe and with Experimenta, we were trying to figure out how we could present something that came out of Bauhaus Imaginista, which essentially ended in 2019. And of course, it's very interesting to bring the project to Calcutta, given the 1922 Bauhaus exhibition that happened in Calcutta and how significant that was, and the way that exhibition has also become increasingly looked at and researched in the last couple of years. And so the decision was to bring a very small collection of materials to the museum in the form of a project called Collected Research. So while we were doing Bauhaus Imaginista, we were also collecting materials, we were documenting, we were filming, we were taking slides, texts were being produced. And of course, the major thing that we did was we produced a website, so the Bauhaus Imaginista online journal, which is a huge repository of materials, which is available obviously for everybody to see online. It's essentially a big online archive. And so the idea was to create an installation that would somehow sort of embody and house the online journal. And we commissioned the artist Luca Frey to make a structure. And so he made the structure, which is called Bauhaus Jukebox. It's a series of boxes, essentially, pink wooden boxes that are stackable and rearrangeable, that can be taken to many different kinds of spaces, and indeed has traveled all over the world. That structure houses a portal where you can access the Bauhaus Imaginista journal, you can print out materials, It also has representations of the Gegenstand, and it has other kind of visual materials. So it's a space that you can enter, and you can do your own research into Bauhaus Imaginista and see the scope of the project. The other element of this touring exhibition, collected research, is 4 films by artists that we commissioned for the project. So a film by Kader Attia that looks at this question of the appropriation of artifacts during the colonial period and the question of restitution. A film by Wendelin von Oldenburg, which addresses the history of a Bauhaus-trained architect called Lotte Stambeza, who traveled to the Ukraine to work when it was part of the Soviet Union, and also was very important in post-war Dutch urban planning. A film by Svi Efrat, which documents the campus in Nigeria, designed by Ariel Sharon, a Bauhaus-trained architect. And then O Horizon, the film that looks at Shantiniketan in the present day.
What you see at the Indian Museum is the collected archival material of the Bauhaus Imaginista exhibition. But this is not all, because we then also invited an Indian artist, Sanchayan Ghosh, to respond to this material and to connect it to the Indian Museum and its collections, and also the particular site in the Indian Museum. And he did a really exciting installation, including material from the collection, the reserve collection of the Indian Museum, as well as archival material from Shantiniketan and Calcutta.
And then we felt it would be important to contextualize this and kind of bring a new element to this. And so through our conversations, we invited Sanchayan Ghosh to make a new installation that would partly frame the archive, but also refer back to this 1922 exhibition at the Bauhaus in Kolkata. And so Sanchayan was particularly interested in this juxtaposition of artists. So in his installation, you see a projection of a work by Paul Klee shown alongside a painting from the Indian Museum collection by Gaganendranath Tagore, juxtaposed after almost 100 years. Sanchayan Ghosh also refers to some of the architecture that you see in Gaganendranath's paintings from the period, which are cubist experiments with architectural forms. And so some of these motifs and forms are incorporated into his installation structure. And the exhibition also includes a text by Sanchayan, which is fragmented and distributed through his installation, but also many texts about the project, so that the visitor to the exhibition hopefully can get a kind of sense of the Bauhaus history, as well as these different histories of Bauhaus internationalism and transcultural reception, which Bauhaus Imaginista was essentially set up to research and present.
When I was approached to conceive a space of trying to host this exhibition, in Indian Museum. So we thought that why not it can re-engage with that moment in history where Indian artists and Bauhaus artists exhibited together, and because Indian Museum has collection of some of those artists who exhibited during that time. So that became a very interesting situation, that it's not a direct archive but more like a facsimile reproduction of certain works of some of the artists which are coming here, and you have some real documents, real paintings from the museum collection, and how they can be placed together in the architectural situation of Indian Museum. So when this proposition came up, I was particularly interested to 2-3 aspects. First of all, to engage with the space of Indian Museum, which is a Victorian architecture, and how do you host avant-garde archive, which is the second aspect, that avant-garde which itself is about intervention, it's about transformation, is being archived, and you are now showing it inside Indian Museum. So how do we keep it in what kind of a speciality that would be generated? The Indian Museum archive was also left open to me, in a sense I can choose from that. So I was also looking at the archive, who are the artists whose works can be shared in this present situation. So there are different artists who are there: Jamini Roy, Abanindranath Tagore, Nandalal Bose, Gaurav Tagore. So their works are there in the collection. So initially I was thinking that maybe I can find certain counter gestures that were happening in the Bauhaus, like designing interior, sitting arrangements and all these kind of things, and find how the whole Bengal school and later on Gaurav and Tagore have addressed these issues in terms of their elements, what they are putting, or gestures. But then, because the exhibition of the Bauhaus is already planned in a kind of an independent, unique situation, I rather thought that let us look at it as a re-engagement of that 1922 situation where Paul Klee is meeting Gaurav, necessarily not knowing each other but coming and meeting. So I thought that maybe it will be an interesting thing, that how today we can create this situation of a museum conversation between archives and real documents, and create an architectural situation which can host this context. So the whole exhibition space is starting off with a conversation between Gaurav and Paul Klee, where I was particularly inspired by this statement of Paul Klee: the drawing is a walk with a line. So it's like as if you're walking, and this idea of the walk became a very interesting thing, that how the exhibition space becomes a travel between these two collections. Okay. So initially you find that there is a kind of a line construction that reconstructs the architectural phenomena of this Victorian interior. And the interesting part of this space is that it's a horizontal situation, that you enter from one side and then you go out from the other. So that was also very interesting for me, that it's almost like a walk. I mean, you are not seeing everything in one go, but you are moving from one zone to the other, and necessarily you can decide whether you want to come back or you want to go out totally. And like the line which I am following as a walk has to somewhere integrate not only the physical archive but also the spatial dynamics somewhere. So that's how this whole process started, that it starts with some linear movements which physically orients the viewer into the space, make them walk into the space, and then you follow the lines and you encounter the Bauhaus main collection, and then slowly you enter into a more collapse of those lines into architectural walls which are somewhat made transparent. Somewhere the element of the triangle, which has been the basis of this whole Victorian model, is upturned, or it is made perforated through, you can see through it, and then you move around it. So it's not very linear kind of a movement that you go through it, and while you move through it you encounter the works of Gaganendranath, you encounter works of Tagore, you encounter some images of Shantiniketan architecture, because I wanted to also bring in the Shantiniketan architecture in this context, because the whole history of modernity in India, Shantiniketan plays a very important, methodologically a very important position. This whole idea of the eclectic movement that it generated, bringing different traditions together into one structure. So I thought that the transition should be that Shantiniketan point, that it was that moment which was creating all this energy. If you look at the Bauhaus segment, the whole archive has been shared in a very personal way, that you can touch the prints, you can take print out, you can sit, you can see something like that. So it's a very complete dialogue of a viewing of an archive and not necessarily looking at artwork. So, but here there is a situation of original artworks. So how do you break that formality of a museum viewing to a more participatory, intimate conversation with the space? So I had to create situations where people can sit, and the design of the sitting and the constructions all becomes part of a sculptural conversation. We have also planned not to hang the original artworks but to put them in shelves, which in Shantiniketan early times, this idea of making shelves and putting things, that whole informality of looking at artwork is very active at that time. Basically the exhibition, changes spaces from the physical space of this architecture and the intervention here to already designed space, which is the Bauhaus display. Then it again moves into a physical engagement with the architecture, and then again it goes into a pre-recorded documents like the films and documentaries which are being shown there. So it constantly moves back and forth between already existing exhibition and then how it is reenacted with the physical space of this architecture.